The second two cases should be illustrative here. Right? They are of a talented man who has the option for a life of leisure, and a well-off man who could help others, but asks if he should be bothered with the misfortunes of others. Right? The talented person is an interesting case. Right? This is somebody who's got the option for a comfortable life, a relaxing life, one that they don't need to exert themselves to develop their talents. Let's say somebody has a talent as an immunologist, right? Just has this knack for immunology, right? Now, this person maybe wins the lottery or inherits a lot of money, or just generally has the option to sit on their arse and eat potato chips and watch television, right? And asks himself if he has a duty to help others, or to develop his talents, rather. It's developing talents, not helping others at this point. Well, he's still got presence of mind enough to ask himself if this is a violation of the first formulation of the categorical imperative somehow. Right? So we ask ourselves, what if we all took it upon ourselves to just sit on our arse and not develop our talents? What if this became a universal law that people ought to do this? Well, what Kant wants to point out is that we can picture a world in which people are all extremely lazy. Right? Nobody develops their talents. But picture life in such a world. You've woken up, you've eaten something, you've walked around, which, mind you, is a talent. Maybe you can walk. Right? Then what do? Do you read a book? No, somebody will have had to develop talents in order to write a book. Do you listen to some music? Talents again. Do you play some games? Sports. You can't have sports, right? Do you learn something? No, that's developing a talent, right? Do you have some sex? No, again, talent, right? It's not going to be very good sex. So what you find is that, well, there's no rational contradiction in the idea of the maxim of your action becoming a universal law, right? The world could very well subsist if nobody developed their talents. Nobody would want to live in such a world, right? Again, in the fourth example here, the well-off man who asks if he should be bothered with the misfortunes of others, well, perhaps no. Right? We could picture somebody who, in terms of their perfect duties, in terms of treating with one another with the absolute rational respect that they deserve, right? Not lying to them, not cheating, not stealing, etc., but not really helping anyone, right? We can picture a world full of beings that might act in this way, and it might, in a lot of ways, be better than the world that we live in. But what if nobody helped anybody? Right? Picture yourself walking down the streets of Detroit, slipping on a patch of ice, breaking your leg, and nobody helps you. Picture your car breaking down on the side of I-75, and nobody helps you. Picture yourself in a horrible situation, and everybody says, oh, not my problem. Right? Nobody would want to live in such a world. So the third and fourth cases show themselves to not be rationally contradictory, but a contradiction in the will. Right? If we go back to the first formulation of the categorical imperative, act only according to that maxim that you can at the same time will that it should be universal law. Right? We find a few things going on. Well, first we isolate the maxim of our actions. Right? What's the principle behind our actions? Secondly, we ask ourselves if there is any rational contradiction with regard to that principle, that maxim, becoming a universal law. If there's not, we move on to the third. If there is, we know we've got a perfect duty not to do that sort of thing. Right? If there's no contradiction there, we ask ourselves, well, what would the world look like? Would anybody want to live in a world where everybody did this thing based on this maxim? Right? In that case, right, if the answer is no, we know we've got an imperfect duty. So a perfect duty rests on a rational contradiction when the principle is universalized. And an imperfect duty rests on a contradiction of the will. Right? A perfect duty is a stronger moral obligation, and imperfect duty is a weaker moral obligation. Right? don't lie, don't kill yourself, are absolute moral duties. You better not do these things. Right? But in the case of the second two examples, develop some of your talents. Should you spend all of your time developing your talents? Should you always and everywhere develop your talents? Maybe not. There has to be some time for sitting on your couch, watching TV, and eating potato chips. Right? Should you help everyone? Always? Maybe not. But you ought to help some people some of the time. So you see that the distinction between perfect and imperfect duty has to do with this sort of strength of the moral claim that's going on there. Right? So that's the distinction between perfect and imperfect duties. Now, categorical imperatives are funny things. Right? A categorical imperative is a command. Right? Do X. Don't lie, don't steal, don't rape, don't murder. It's an absolute command, right? And in this way, it holds moral sway over all rational beings, insofar as we're rational, insofar as we can think about these things and ask ourselves questions in terms of these categorical imperatives. Our duty is clear. Whereas hypothetical imperatives, right? If you want to be happy, you ought to do X. Yeah, that's an imperative of prudence, or a pragmatic imperative, as Kant calls it. Right? If you want to be happy, you ought to do X. Well, that's a weaker moral obligation, because just how happy do I want to be? Right? Now, imperatives of skill, likewise, are another form of hypothetical imperative. Right? If you want to get into grad school, you've got to write the GRE. Maybe you don't want to get into grad school. If you want to get into law school, you've got to write the LSAT. Maybe you don't want to get into law school. Right? So, in both cases, imperatives of skill, or technical imperatives, or imperatives of prudence, or pragmatic imperatives, are aimed at some sort of relative end. Whereas categorical imperatives are commands that are issued. There's no wiggle room. Right? These are absolute duties. So all moral imperatives, by Kant's argument here, ought be expressed in terms of categorical imperatives if they are going to hold sway over all rational creatures. We don't want there to be wiggle room, and we don't want this to be a matter of opinion. Right? Now, that ends that